Hi, everyone. It's Greg here from grouplessons.com, and I have with me Daniel Patterson from growyourmusicstudio.com. And today we're going to talk a little bit about class control. I know, Daniel, that this is a big fear factor for a lot of teachers that are moving from one-on-one lessons to group lessons. How am I going to keep a crowd of students from running away with the control of the class? And I wanted to bring you in because I have always respected the way you approach class control. I would dare say that between you and me, I think you might have the edge over me. I probably put up with too much in my class. You've had quite a lot of experience teaching group lessons too in your neck of the woods, and so I wanted to start out with just a question for you. What exactly is class control? Is it about discipline and rules? What is it?
Okay. So I think it can include that. And I do think when the term classroom control is invoked, I do think people think about setting rules, having rules for the kids, having limits on behavior. I think that's good. But one of the principles that I found to be really important in my own group lesson system was the idea of creating a learning environment, an environment that was safe for kids to be in, that was nurturing, that promoted learning, and then even beyond that, created a space in which kids felt like they could explore. And of course have fun and those sorts of things. So for me, yes, I really had a no or a zero tolerance policy for any kind of behavior that I considered disruptive. And as you mentioned earlier, yeah, I was probably a little bit more hard-nosed than you are around that. I think it's just due to personality. You're a much more fun person than I am. But for me, the far more important, the reason that existed was not to be a hard-nosed disciplinarian. It wasn't so that, I could fulfill some sort of kind of secret, I disliked kids and therefore I was really just trying to let those kids have it. It wasn't that. It was always for a greater purpose. And that greater purpose was I wanted them to learn as much music as possible in as short a time as possible. And so for me, to finally land the plane here, the idea was if I could create an environment that allowed for that to happen, then I will have fulfilled my mission. I was in control of the classroom. And so, yes, were there rules? Were there things that I would allow and wouldn't? Of course, but it was always in service of that greater purpose, which was to create a learning environment in which kids could move through their books very, very quickly. So that's kind of how I define that term.
All right. So I want to swap a couple stories, and first of all, I am going to go first, and I'm going to show a book that, here it is. This is a book that has been a huge influence on me and how I run the order of class and class control. It is The First Days of School. Great read, easy read. It's a popular book. Are you going to pull it off your shelf too?
I think it's over my wife's side of the bookcase.
Okay, that's all right. It's a popular book for school teachers, especially public school and private school teachers. But I think for anyone teaching in groups, it's a great book. A lot of the ideas that I have for starting class with an opening procedure, starting class with something that's predictable and routine, comes straight out of that book. And one of the things that I have in my tips in the teacher guides that we're putting our Piano Express teachers through, one of the things that I say is to enforce your guidelines with a yellow card and a red card, like a soccer game. If there's an infraction to a guideline, I use these words, guidelines and infractions. If there's a guideline infraction, then I love yellow cards because they are just nonverbal. I don't have to break stride. I can keep teaching, but I drop a yellow card in front of a student to warn them, you're interrupting me right now, and I need you to stop. But I don't have to say it. The card says it for me. And if that child, if their impulse control is like so low that they before the end of the class they break the guideline again, then they get a red card, and they also get sent home with a guideline infraction form. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that on the second story that we swap. I want to tell you about some of the experiences that I've had this year with sending children home with guideline infraction forms, because I know that that is another fear factor with teachers, especially teachers that are new to groups. It's like, oh no, how am I going to talk to the parents about this? They're going to think that I'm angry, or I lost control, or I'm that their kid is the bad kid in my class. It might do damage, and I want to say very much that the opposite is true, but I'll get to that. I know that there is a book that has been a big influence on you, and I want you to talk a little bit about that book and what you've taken from it. And the book I'm talking about, of course, is Teaching with Love and Logic. So you take it.
Yes. Yeah. So that book, alongside of First Days of School, were both introduced to me by my wife, because she was a public school teacher. She taught 7th grade English or language arts for a couple years before she moved to higher education. She introduced both of those books to me, and my wife and I have always had a very conversational and collaborative relationship. And so she said, I'm learning some things in here that you should absolutely know about. And we would have these long conversations about this book, how she was using this in her classroom at her school. Very, very helpful. So I would say that the big idea that I took away, or the big ideas that I took away from Love and Logic in the classroom, and you can read these right in the book. There are 3 rules that they have in Love and Logic: set enforceable limits, provide choices within limits, and apply consequences with empathy. And of course, they detail this pretty exhaustively in that book. It's a rather large book, but it really is around not acting as a drill sergeant with the kids. That you're actually trying to give them choices and telling them what is going to happen if they make certain choices versus other ones. And so it's this more conversational, almost Socratic way of doing discipline. And it involves, again, going back to those environmental ideas that I gave earlier, it's about setting an environment. So let me give a perfect example of this, of providing choices. So instead of just saying, hey, open your technique book, turn to page X. Now, I would do that plenty. But for a child who was more towards the beginning, I would probably have a little bit more empathy towards that child, getting them acclimated to the group environment that they were in. So I would maybe say something like, would you rather start in your technique book or your lesson book today? Now, on the surface, this could feel tactical. It could feel like a little hack. It could feel kind of inconsequential. Yeah, if you did it once, it probably is. It probably would be. It was about using this method of classroom control consistently with kids all the time, days at a time, weeks, months, years. They began to realize that you were kind of sharing with them. Now, on the other hand, I would be very clear, and this isn't necessarily with Love and Logic. I think it's just important to kind of mention this, that I'm not talking about letting kids dictate how the class is going to run. I think sometimes, having talked to a lot of teachers about this, there is sometimes this, it is kind of misconstrued, I think, sometimes. When a child would come into the classroom for the first time, I would be very directive with them. Because the other part, I think, of classroom control is that absent a plan, a child will create one. And you're probably not going to like their plan.
Yes.
And
amen.
so,
Preach.
yeah. So, and this really came down to the longer I taught group and the way that I taught it, the more confident I was about what needed to happen with a child at any given time. And again, this isn't over against what I just said. I gave children choices within the range of choices that I was happy of them making. I didn't care if they started with their lesson or technique book. There were some things that I never gave them a choice on. And they just felt those walls, and they could exist within those walls. But again, in creating an environment that felt safe for them, children do crave those limits. They want to know where the limit is. And if you give it to them and you can do it with a sense of, I wouldn't say casualness. I would say if you can do it without anxiety, I think that's really it. So if a child would come in and sometime during that first lesson, they would do something that I didn't think was contributing to a peaceful, calm environment in which all kids could focus on what they needed to do. And so I would simply redirect them, and I would be pretty hard-nosed about it, but I would be very pleasant. There wouldn't be an ounce of emotion that I would bring into it. This is not Love and Logic. Right. I'm not saying that they're against this in Love and Logic. I'm just saying this is something I kind of learned separate from that book, but really dovetails quite well with it. That anytime that I delivered enforcement, or anytime that I felt negative emotions coming up in me, that was an opportunity for me to really step back and question myself, not the child. Yes. If the child did something that would bring emotion up in me, that's not their fault. Right. That's me reacting to something inside of them, and that's something that I needed to kind of deal with myself. And so I would just say that over time, I learned to kind of be this very pleasant, very steady, very predictable person to that child. And so I was goofy. I made a lot of jokes. But when it came to if it came to misbehavior or a child pushing buttons that they shouldn't be pushing on the piano, that sort of thing, I would redirect without emotion. But I would be, I'll use the word stern, and I would drop the character I had been playing. Right. And so when they were redirected, then I turned it back on, and I became that other guy. Okay. And so I think that those kids really saw that, and it only took seeing that a couple times that they just kind of stopped. And I never really had, to be quite honest, in close to a decade and a half of teaching group, it was very rare that I had to talk to a parent about a child's behavior in the lesson. It was a very, very rare occurrence. And I really think that those Love and Logic principles, which you can even go online and look at a summary of the book. To be honest, I've never read the entire book. I got the Cliff Notes from my wife, and she said, read these chapters. And she told me the chapters to read. Yeah. And that's what I read. And first days of school, same thing. There were certain parts I read. There were other parts I kind of got the Cliff Notes from my wife in long discussion with her. And then just talking out situations that were happening as I was becoming a better group teacher. So, I don't know. There's a lot to think about there. First days of school, Love and Logic, this kind of calm demeanor that you need to approach the studio with, not bringing your own anxiety into the environment, because those kids are really going to sense that. Mm-hmm. It's like blood in the water and sharks. Those kids will sense that anxiety. Yeah. And it was interesting because those kids could do something and they never saw a monster come out. Mm-hmm. Even if, maybe something they did was, like, I had a child knock over something once quite accidentally. They went over to get a pencil. They knocked the whole thing of like a whole container full of pencils and pens onto the floor, broke the glass container that it was in, and everyone looked at me and I just, oh no, just make sure you don't step on the glass. But I could see that child like seize up in like a panic, and look at me like I was gonna be really mad at them. That just never came out. And so I think that is actually kind of a huge part of it. And obviously probably beyond the scope of this video to talk about how to become a more meditative, calm, non-anxious person. But I do think that is a big part of it. So I don't know, Greg, any thoughts or pushback there?
No, I love that. I believe that, and we've talked about this in other videos about other things, but anxiety that you feel in class is almost never to maybe even never about the child. It's about what's inside of you. I totally believe that. I believe that if a teacher is feeling angry, it's not because of something the child is doing. It's because the teacher does not know how to stay in control. The teacher wants control, doesn't know how to stay in control, and that's what produces anger. And so don't take it out on the kids. Go home at the end of the day and you can think about it in the quietness. Like I stared at the ceiling of my bedroom after lights out, just thinking about how do I do things different, because I didn't want to react in class, but I knew it's like, okay, I'm going to have to take this home and think about this, because there's improvement to be made. And that is such a big deal, because if students know that they're always going to get the same teacher every week, they're not going to get the angry or the calm, or it depends on the day, or depends on the behavior of the students, they will ultimately respect the teacher. It's like a slow, they say you can lose a battle and win a war, right? And maybe in that moment you don't know how to react. It's like, man, if I just blow up on this kid, they'll probably stop acting up for the rest of this class. You might win that battle, but you could at the same time lose the war of really having the class respect you as a teacher. And so I love
keeping the student.
Yeah, all those things. So I wanted to say in my last year of teaching, if I can think through, I think there might have been 2 times in the last year where I've had to talk to a parent about a guideline infraction form. Usually if a student is going home with a guideline infraction form because they got a yellow card and a red card in class, I want to talk to the parents just to bring in a little bit of a bigger team. And I have found that this is one of the most this is one of the biggest opportunities for me to create a trust bond with that family, if I can do this the right way. Because parents, they already know that their kid is a disruptive kid. If that child is, if it's a child that's like perpetually disruptive, they've already gotten letters sent home from school. They've probably had, in the big realm of all the teachers that student sees in all their different classes, they've probably seen some varied reactions. And if I can come in with the mindset that it takes a village to raise a child, and here I am, I want to be part of that village. I care about your child. I want your child to understand how to respond and behave in the context of a classroom. And so I will always say a few things, and I need to make sure that I hold it together. All those things that we've just talked about, I need to make sure that I keep it together in my class, so I can go out and look a parent in the eye and say, there were some interruptions today. There were some guidelines that your child knows about, and for one reason or the other, they had crossed these guidelines today. And so I have a guideline infraction form. And what that is just some thoughtful questions. I came up with these questions on my own. A copy of this guideline infraction form is included in all of the licensees' packets, so they're going to have my copy if they want to just print it and use it. But there's questions, why does this studio have this guideline? I want students to stop and think from my point of view, like why does this guideline exist in the first place? And then they write it out. Even better, if that child can't write yet, they talk to the parent and the parent writes it out. And then it's a family exercise. And why did I choose to cross that guideline? And I love the word choice, going back to what you said, empowering the child, helping that child understand that they do have choices and they have that power. And then how can I choose to make better choices, or how can I make better choices in the next class? And so these reflective questions. And so I will go out and I'll tell a parent, these things happened in class today. I'm not angry. I don't feel like we lost control of the class, but I do want your child to learn how to stay in the context of a classroom. And parents really appreciate that. There was actually not me, but my Sterling manager, Julian, he had this conversation with a child, and our brightest, most glowing review on Google reviews came after Julian had this conversation with this child. And this child was he was on the autism spectrum. He was struggling in school. there were teachers that were just mad at him all the time. Poor kid. And this teacher learned that my studio was going to be a safe place for that child to learn, and that child was going to be respected as a human being as he learned to acclimate to a classroom. And that mom is a fan for life because of our guideline infraction forms. So I wondered if you have ever had any stories from your studio where you had to enforce rules and you saw a stronger bond either between you and the class, the student, family, whatever.
I don't know. I can't think of a place where there was like just this, huge, egregious error that a child made. Like usually they were just small corrections. That's what I kind of experienced in mine, where maybe the child was just a little wound up that day. Maybe they were having a bad day. There were a few times where there were siblings in the same class, and a lot of times I could prevent a lot of those problems by just putting them on the opposite side of the room facing away from each other at different pianos.
Right.
So there's things like that. I will say, though, there are a lot of stories where I can remember where a parent was actually surprised because they'd say, well, are you sure they're behaving? Because they don't. We get a lot of reports from school that they don't behave. And I'd say, you can come in and sit and watch if you'd like. And I would have parents come in and sit and watch. And the hour would go by, and they watch through the glass door their child for an hour, basically focus on their music. Now, of course, they know mom was watching. Maybe they know dad was watching. But I personally didn't really see a lot of difference in behavior between that week and the week before. It was a normal Tuesday for me. And that parent, would say, well, what's going on? And this is where I think there's actually practical wisdom or rules that we can give here for, an instructor or an owner that's watching.
Sure.
And that is, and this is where, maybe I can just kind of list out a few things to think about, things to do, actual actions to take. As I said earlier, if you don't have a plan, the child will. And so open class with a very strong procedure, like Greg was saying, this could be the most important thing you do, because if you can get them through that first 2 to 5 minutes, they will settle in. We are embodied, okay? We have emotions, we have blood sugar levels, we have are you dehydrated? Maybe you need more water. Like, so much behavior can just come from maybe just the child's hungry or something. So if we can settle them into a routine, there's a much greater chance that child will then just kind of, not hypnotically, but maybe a little bit like that. Like that routine actually is a little bit of hypnosis. Next thing is just there's an awareness of what they need to be working on. So I was very directive in what I said. Do this, do this. I didn't beat around the bush. I didn't, try to ease kids into things. I was very directive, again, on those things that I didn't leave up to choice. The child could choose what they wanted to do with this song, but I would tell them, work on this, if that was what I wanted them to work on next. And if I ever got a sense that a child was floundering, I knew exactly what I needed to do to redirect them. So if they, how much bad behavior did I save from happening simply by just being self-aware in the room of all the different kids and being like, oh, this kid, in my own head, is struggling with where to put their right hand. It's so obvious by how they're acting. And so I would just come over, your right hand goes here. And instead of spending 5 minutes trying to bash something into their head, try to get them to Socratically figure it out, I just take their hand and say, no, I wouldn't take their hand. I take my hand, put it on the keyboard, say, this is where your hands go. Can you do that? And they do that.
Yeah.
Okay, now play. And then walk away. So just a couple, I think, practical things there that a studio owner could do or a teacher could do in the context of a group. But a lot of it just comes down to being self-aware, being environmentally aware. This is a big one. I'm going to add one here. I see so many teachers do this. I've actually had occasion to work with some of the studios that I've helped convert to group lessons where they were having some behavioral issues, and I said, record a class, let me see the video, and I'll fix the problem. and I just wasn't even prepared for what I saw. It was just...
Okay. All right.
It became so apparent to me, like immediately within 30 seconds, what the problem was. Because, and I see teachers do this I've seen more than one teacher do this because I've done this exercise more than once, where they'll say something, the child immediately ignores it, and they start doing something on their own, and then the teacher approves of the behavior with their words. Let me give you an example, because that's kind of abstract. I see this. And it's a psychological coping mechanism for the teacher, and I know why they're doing it. It is a defense mechanism on the teacher's part to overcome their own feelings of powerlessness in that situation. I'll explain how this works. They'll say, okay, we're going to play this song now. And then the 6-year-old starts playing some high keys. Oh, I see you found the high keys there. Oh, don't you like those sounds? And they suddenly... They're doing this because they're trying to take control of the situation without actually having to take control of the situation. And then they feel bad that the child's not listening to them. So they make the child's behavior okay after the fact by pretending as if it's okay that the child is doing this. I see teachers do this quite a bit. Or I have seen teachers do this quite a bit. And when I saw it happen more than once, or I thought this must be something that teachers struggle with. This kind of making it okay after the fact by kind of de facto giving the child their blessing to ignore everything they said. And once you start doing that, they will do it more and more. And so if that happened in a class, let's say a trial lesson for me, first time I've met this kid, maybe they're a little rowdy, they're trying to figure out what's going on, and they do something like that, I just say, that actually isn't what I wanted you to do. Could you put your hands right here and do this? And most of the time that took care of it. And I would say it in a certain tone. Again, I'd drop the character a little bit. And if they wouldn't do it, I wouldn't say a word. I'd say, oh, you must not have heard me. Could you put your hands here and do this? And I literally, this had happened before. I was in a trial lesson and I said that 5 or 6 times. And the child ignored me every single time until they didn't. And then they didn't ignore me after that. And all I was going to say was that, again, this kind of leans back on what I said earlier in this recording, and that is, for me, in that moment, I could feel inside that I was heating up a little bit, but it wasn't anger towards the child. It was like, ooh, this is kind of an awkward situation because this is the first time they've met me, like what's this parent thinking? But that's about all the inner soundtrack did, but I didn't let that come out. And so the child just kind of experienced this very neutral, very calm response to their behavior. Probably something they don't experience a lot in life, to be quite honest. And so it's probably a little unfamiliar to them at first, but I just saw that technique work very, very well with kids, where you just repeat, you're calm, you're neutral. I don't know. It never happened. I'm glad it didn't, but if the child did that like 20 times where they just kept ignoring, I don't know what I'd do. Like, what if I just did that for a straight half hour? Because I'd be committed to it. I would do it. But probably at a certain point, I would call the game and just say to the parent, I don't know. I don't think they want to do this. Maybe we should try again in a year.
Yeah. Yeah.
You got to stick to your guns.
That is so good. Just being consistent and yeah, you can't compromise. Like, if you want control of the class, then you have to stay within your own rules that you make for yourself. Wow. All right. Well, Daniel, we've got to land this plane. Thank you so much for having this conversation. I think that this is so good. Like, it's inspiring for me to hear your ideas. So thanks for coming on and talking to our people that are training with the Piano Express.